Ni hao, ayubowan, greetings. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is not my first visit, and I'm delighted to be back to the beautiful island of Taiwan. It's a pleasure to visit the wonderful people, the cuisine, the scenery. It reminds me of my home, Sri Lanka, because the temperature and the vegetation is very similar. So I feel very much at home. I'm also privileged to speak to so many renowned energy experts as well as the concerned public. And I congratulate the newspaper on organizing this meeting. I understand that there are some key political figures here, so we hope that the discussions will have some impact, especially with elections to come and so on. I'm not an expert on the energy sector in Taiwan, but my remarks will be more to do with the context of sustainable energy development, some general principles, and of course we'll see how this applies in the case of Taiwan. Let me just begin by saying that people are looking for integrated solutions to 21st century energy issues. So this is within the framework of sustainable energy development, which I will explain to you, and something called balanced inclusive green growth. Just to give you an example of the world interest, last year I was with President Obama in Portugal. We launched the Porto Protocol. There were 3,500 top businessmen from Europe who pledged to fight climate change and also poverty. Also last year, my own president had asked me to prepare a document for Sri Lanka, which is called Sustainable Sri Lanka 2030 Vision and Strategic Path. And I presented the report. It was prepared by 40 top experts, but also energy was a very important element of this. Let's move on to the substance. What are the major issues of sustainable development we face? All countries, including Taiwan. We have poverty and inequality, which has been there for a long time. We have resource shortages. Energy is one, but there's also water and food. We have problems with the financial sector. We have unexpected shocks and disasters, even typhoons in this season. We have conflicts, which are human-made disasters. We have, unfortunately, very weak leadership at the global level. And I can't stress how much this is hurting the world. And of course, we have climate change, which is an ultimate threat multiplier, which means that climate change makes all the other problems worse. So this is not good. Now, these multiple threats are interrelated. They can all work badly. Stakeholders, 7.5 billion people on this planet, are not so united. Unfortunately, we are trying to solve one problem at a time, and this is something I will stress to you as well. Energy and the energy transformation cannot be solved in isolation. It has to be solved as a part of the sustainable development path, right? And fortunately for us, what we find is that although world leaders are weak, there are many middle-level leaders, fortunately, mayors of cities, community leaders, CEOs of companies who are much more positive, okay? So we are going to find the solution. Now let me talk very quickly about resource limits and inequality. There is a concept called the ecological footprint of humanity, which is the sum total of resources the human race uses from the planet. In 2012, we needed 50% more than the sustainable capacity of the planet. So we needed 1.5 Earths. By 2030, if we continue along this consumption trajectory, we will need the equivalent of 2 planets to sustainably support our lifestyles. Clearly not a good policy. And also Taiwan, I understand, is also exceeding its ecological limits. If you look at who is doing this consumption? Here's another story. This is the infamous champagne glass, which tells you 85% of consumption is done by the top 20 percentile, 1.5 billion people on the planet. They are consuming 60 or 70 times more than the bottom 20 percentile. Just imagine in 2016, the 8 richest people in the world owned more wealth than half the world's population. Staggering inequality, right? So if you put those two facts together at the top, you will see what happens in the bottom. You see, when the rich are already using more than one planet worth, where are the resources to help the poor? This is a question I've asked many global leaders at international conferences. They are very embarrassed. They have no answer. And that's why we have 70 years or more of unmet goals and broken promises. In 1947, we had the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a wonderful document. Every country signed it. We have now come in 2015 to the Sustainable Development Goals and so on. And let me assure you, every one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals was already in that original document more than 70 years ago. That is why I say we have not made much progress, and this is really a last chance for humanity. Just to mention also the work of the IPCC, because it's very close to my heart. The two key points we have to remember with all this scientific knowledge is, first, poor countries and the poorest groups will suffer most. This is very unfair because they did not create the problem. It is created by the rich and their emissions, but the poor will suffer most. The hopeful message is what I told you at the beginning. If we take a sustainable development path, we will not only solve problems of poverty and health, but we can also solve climate change. So we all solve all the problems together, not one at a time. And this is also true for the energy transformation. Just to tell you a little bit the background, how the world is structured. See, we have a biogeophysical resource base. I mean, it's the air we breathe, the water and the land and so on. On top of that, we have productive economic assets, the machines, capital, labor, and so on. And then right on top of that, we have the financial aggregates, economic growth, market indicators, and so on. And ideally, the three levels should be very closely linked, right, for the world to work well. So one's head is in the clouds because you're making money on the stock market, but your feet must be firmly on the ground. You must know what you're doing to nature, right? Now, the first thing is that the financial markets can sometimes separate from the value of economic assets. This is what happened in 2008 with the asset bubble. It is going to happen again with all of the money that is being pumped into the system, right? And that is a very dangerous sign. It's an economic bubble. There is also a social bubble. Economic growth hides the ugly fact that there is a lot of poverty in the world. Almost 2 billion people who are still poor, right? When that bubble bursts, it will also cause major problems. And the third bubble is, of course, the environmental bubble. Climate change is one of them. But we are separating from our natural resource base. So the head is separated from the feet, right? And we have this problem of pushing problems into the future, which is you use now, but you pay later. It's a debt syndrome. And this is not a good, healthy way to go. Now, if you look at priorities, how have our world leaders today addressed the problem? For the problems of the rich, really, bailing out banks and companies, 10 trillion, huge amounts of money was spent. For helping the poor, about 100 billion a year, okay, which is 1/100th that amount. And for climate and other things, a few $1 billion, pocket change, right? World military expense, almost 2 trillion 2 years ago, right? So the money is not being placed on the key issues. I'll skip this because just to tell you about the risky future, that if we have unrestrained market forces with all these problems of bubbles, without ethical and moral values, which I will talk about a little bit later, they will combine with poverty, inequity, terrorism, all of these, and climate change to create chaos and a world which will not be a nice place to live in. And we have to avoid that. That is why we want this balanced, inclusive green growth path. So the vision is something like Earth eco-civilization of the 21st century. And we will look not only at material consumption, because we are very preoccupied with GDP growth now, but also other things that contribute to welfare, happiness, and well-being. Okay, there are other measures that we can pursue. On the economic side, we want to build a prosperous economy. To be sustainable does not mean to be poor, right? Because we have to raise the poor out of poverty. But we have to satisfy social requirements, which is meeting basic needs, especially of the poor, ensuring peace and harmony. Environmentally, we want to respect nature and live within the constraints of the ecology. And this is why we have the 2030 Agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals approved in 2015. And the motto there is leave no one behind, because we are one human race. And we want to make sure we take everybody with us. There are the 17 goals. I'm not going to read them out, but poverty is the #1 goal. Remember that climate change, although people talk a lot about it, is only one of 17 goals. That's why we have to solve all the problems together, right? Now, how can we move forward with all these problems? It's not hopeless. We have, in fact, a framework called Sustainomics, which I first presented in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. And that is where the balanced, inclusive green growth path emerged. And the paradigm of sustainable energy development. This is to make development more sustainable by integrating energy policy into national development strategy. So it must be smoothly integrated into your sustainable development curve. Now, how does this work? The old concept of energy many years ago was purely engineering. People said, okay, this is supply technology, you have technical efficiency, thermodynamics, it's all a question of physics and engineering. Then the economic aspect came in because people realized that it's expensive. So we need to build power plants that are the cheapest and most effective. You have price and income elasticities, cost-benefit analysis, all the economic dimension. Then the social came. People said, well, what about the poor? Can they afford this? How do we make it accessible to everybody? And finally, the environment. Because in the process of producing a lot of energy, we were destroying the environment. So this is what is sustainable energy development, which is the core concept of, the first core concept of Sustainomics. That any issue, including energy, can be resolved or analyzed in terms of the 3 dimensions. So you have an economic dimension because you want prosperity to help the poor, but you also want the environmental dimension to look after your ecology, and you want the social dimension to include everybody, leave no one behind. And there are 3 kinds of assets for this, right? You have built capital, the buildings, the machines, and other things that make the economy work. You have natural capital, the air, the land, and the water. Then you have social capital. Extremely important. I think the political leaders are well aware of this. Social capital is the glue that binds society together. Without this, we will have conflicts, we have major problems, and it is undervalued, and we don't pay enough attention. Okay? And what is most important is the values and ethics within a cultural matrix, which you have to protect. They are very precious, right? Don't take them for granted. The second core concept is what I call climb the mountain, which means that Sustainable development is a little bit mysterious, even to me. Every day I'm learning something new, and I hope I learn something from you too. The peak is covered with clouds, but we never give up. We take one step at a time, and eventually we will reach the top, right? So when we leave the room, we switch off the light. We turn off a tap. We can plant a tree. We don't have to wait for leaders to tell us what to do. This is a mistake. You should be empowered to do act now. And that is the second core principle. And this can be done not only at the individual level, but also at the level of cities, communities, companies, and so on. Okay? Corporate social responsibility, sustainability, accounting, triple bottom line, and so on. This is very important for business, and more businesses, and I'll tell you examples later on, are following this approach. Because although many environmentalists feel that business is part of the problem, I feel that business should be part of the solution, because they are doers and they can be harnessed to solve the problems of sustainable development. The third core concept has to do with our own minds, innovation, and fresh ideas. We have to transcend certain mental barriers. Okay? For example, the values that we have, which are greed and selfishness and so on, very unsustainable. We have to replace them. We have to think in terms of multidisciplinary analysis, because it is not a question of only engineering or economics or law or medicine, but all of these, right? And this is not easy. We have to think in terms of global spatial dimensions, not just our country or our city or our home. We have to think in terms of long time spans, maybe decades, sometimes even centuries, not just tomorrow or the next week. And we have to think in terms of multiple stakeholders, because we are all in this together, and unless we work together, it is not possible to solve the problem. Particularly, governments are less and less capable of solving the problems by themselves. So civil society and business must help, must push the governments to do the right thing, right? There is, I know, in many countries, including my own, there is less confidence in politicians, but they are elected to govern, and we would be neglectful if we did not push them to do the right thing, right? Not just vote for them, but throughout the year to push them, be active. The importance of values. Unethical social values like greed, selfishness, corruption, violence are currently the driving forces in the world. Not in any particular country, but throughout the world, particularly corruption, rampant. This has led to a model of what we call economic maldevelopment. Okay? So everything is built on debt. There is inequality and overconsumption and other things, right? Poverty. If you think of your grandparents, they saved a lot. Because they saved and invested, you and I have a very good lifestyle. But what are we doing? We are not saving so much. We are borrowing. We are borrowing from our children and grandchildren. So our lifestyle is very good, but we will leave a big problem for the next generations, and that is the environmental debt as well as the financial debt, right? So that's why you have climate change and other problems, but also shortages of energy and food and so on. And don't forget, the fewer resources you have, the more the conflicts. There are no wars over weapons of mass destruction. This is a complete lie. Every war that has been done is for oil, for land, for water. So the less resources you have, the more people will fight. And then your social values also go down. So this is an unsustainable triangle. We have to break it. We try now, but we also have to educate our young children from the kindergarten with the right values, ethical and moral values. Otherwise, we will not be able to solve this, and the sustainable development space will shrink, right? We have to transcend disciplines. Definitely Sustainomics is a course I teach also, and I've written a number of books. We know that the problems of sustainable development are multidisciplinary. Everything from social justice, institutions, markets, technologies, and so we need the full range of disciplines: philosophy, sociology, politics, engineering, and then basically the natural sciences at the bottom. So we have to combine all those. Now this may sound a little bit unfair, okay, because basically what we are saying is, when I was a student, PhD student, my supervisor said, you have to know in your narrow area of physics, whatever, you have to be the world's leading expert. If you are, then we will give you your degree. Now I tell my graduate students the same story. In your expertise, you have to be the best. Make an original research. But it's not enough. You have also to be broad, because you have to know a little bit about the other disciplines. It seems very unfair, but that is the way the world is. Our problems are so complex now that we need people who think in transdisciplinary terms, right? And transcending stakeholder boundaries, I mentioned, business and civil society must work with government to solve the problems of sustainable development, and it can be done. The last core concept is very important. It's implementation. Certainly in my country and also in other parts of the world, we have brilliant reports. We have many laws and regulations, but they're never implemented. So nothing happens. Okay? That is implement, implement, implement. And there are many case studies and examples all over the world which can be borrowed and adapted. So if you ask me, I will tell you. I don't have time to give you all the details today. Now, let me talk to you about this BIGG path. What does BIGG mean? Balanced, okay? Inclusive means socially inclusive. That is one side of the triangle. Green means environmentally green. That's the second side of the triangle. Growth means economically prosperous. So the three elements of the triangle are there. How do we understand this? Let me just give you a quick diagrammatic explanation. If you think of, say, environment in terms of, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions vertically, and economy, let's say GDP per capita horizontally, right? If you are a poor country, you have low emissions at point A, and you have low GDP. If you are a rich country, you are at point C at the top, right? And you will be emitting above the safe limit, but you are rich, so you can protect yourself. And many countries like Taiwan, like Sri Lanka, are in the middle, point B, right? So there is some disharmony there. There is no balance in the sustainable development triangle, which is why some of these countries are exceeding the limit. The past growth curve paradigm has been not so good. So what is the first step? The first step is that we have asked the rich countries to bring down their resource use. So they should be using less energy, less water, and so on, materials and so on. And they can do this. We have the technology now to produce much more using fewer resources. This is the message of resource efficiency, right? For the OECD. Now, so you're balancing the you're balancing the economy and the environment. You have economic growth, you continue, but you reduce the environmental damage. The second part of the message is for us who are growing, we should not follow the profligate, the wasteful curve of the rich. We have to learn from their mistake. And this is called the tunnel path, which I proposed about 20 or more years ago. And in fact, countries like Korea have modeled their growth along these lines. So through innovation, we can learn the technologies, the methods and tools from the advanced countries and find the tunnel to reach the same point, but with much less resource use. And we will, because we are more dynamic, we can be more competitive in international markets. And this is why Asia and other Asia is on the rise now. Okay, and then the last part. It is not enough to be environmentally green. You have also to be inclusive and pro-poor. So therefore, that is beyond green growth, it is inclusive green growth. And you can find that. We have the modeling and the methods and the tools to do this. And this is the path that we have to, the tunnel path that we have to find. And the sustainable energy development that we are talking about, the transformation, lies within this tunnel. And it's not difficult. We have models, macroeconomic models, which I have developed and other leading scientists, to integrate climate, energy, all of these issues into the national development policy. Okay, there are many models. We can use expanded green national accounts, which means that you are not only looking at GDP in terms of material flows, but also this impact on environment. Okay, this is called environmental impacts. And then you're also looking at the income distribution. As the country becomes richer, who is getting the profit? Make sure that the wealth is properly distributed. So this has to be done. And of course, we have various tools: economic cost-benefit analysis, environmental assessment, social assessment, and so on and so forth. Many tools and methods to do this. Now, this looks like a complicated diagram, but I will tell you the essence. The essence is that you cannot solve your sustainable energy problem by itself. If you take the electricity sector, it is a subsector, part of the whole energy mix. So you have coal, you have oil and gas, you have various things, even firewood, which some people burn. So you have to think in terms of integrating your policies, supply and demand policies for power within the broader energy mix and the energy matrix. But it is not enough. The energy sector is part of a multi-sectoral economy. There is transport, there are buildings, industry, and all that. So you have to integrate your energy policy within that matrix. That is the national macroeconomy. And the national economy lives within an international global economy. If the price of oil goes up, there is a problem. If something else happens, crisis in the Middle East, that's another problem. So you have to look at everything in an integrated framework, and that is why we cannot have simple solutions like saying no nuclear. Because if it is no nuclear, it can be done, but we have to ask the implications. We have to educate people and say, okay, that is your choice, but then the consequences are this. I know many countries which are saying no nuclear and also no coal, which means it puts tremendous pressure on the energy planners. Now the problems can be solved, but it could be costly. So all these interrelationships, the risks, have to be explained, and the linkages, the integration has to be properly done. These are not simple problems, right? Sustainable energy development strategy has been now very closely linked with the Paris Climate Accords, of course, but also you have SDG 7, which is on energy, SDG 8, if it affects economic growth, because energy is a driver of the economy, SDG 13, climate, and 14 and 15, environment. So all of these SDGs are also linked together. You have the policy options, regulations, pricing, technology options, of which energy efficiency is the forgotten one. I've worked on energy efficiency since the first oil crisis in 1974. And this is still a key part of the solution. Whenever the demand goes up, the tendency is build more supply. But you should also look at demand management and conservation options, because they may be the cheaper solution. Renewable energy, of course, and advanced energy technologies, okay, which you are, of course, looking at in Taiwan. Just let me give you a very quick sample of sustainable energy pricing, okay? The first rule, the economic rule, is that prices should reflect the cost of supply. So if the cost of supply is rising, raise the price, right? This is the way to get people to conserve and so on. Then you bring in environment, the second side of the triangle. And you say, well, energy consumption is causing pollution. Cars are emitting exhaust fumes, generation plants are polluting. So we have to put a tax. This is called a pollution tax. That means the price of energy goes up a little bit more, right? But this is not the end of the story. Now, if you look at the social side, then you ask the question, well, if we keep raising the price, how can the poor afford, right? Eventually, is it only the rich who will have access to energy because it's so expensive? No, we have pricing structures which allow the poor to meet their basic energy needs, and at the same time we give the right price signals to industry and other consumers. So the three elements of the triangle are also there in sustainable energy pricing. These are other ways of ranking. For example, if you look at environmental rank, renewables are much better than fossil fuels in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at economic rank, you will see that renewable costs tend to be a little higher than fossil fuel costs. So there are trade-offs, right? And there's a whole range of values here because it depends on the type of fuel and the type of technology. But these are some of the trade-offs that have to be taken into account. I'll just give you one quick example of multi-criteria analysis and then we'll move on about finding the BIGG path. This is an example of small hydro projects in Sri Lanka. We looked at 25 small hydro projects. And how do you choose for sustainability? So we picked three variables. The economic variable is least cost. What is the cheapest site? The cheapest site is the best one, right? Hydro, small hydro. The social cost is resettlement. That is, when you build a hydroelectric dam, you have to move people out of villages. So the lowest resettlement means the lowest social cost. Environment. We also calculated when you flood the land that there is a loss of biodiversity. So loss of biodiversity is, you want to keep that low. That is the environmental indicator. So you have an economic, social, and environmental indicator. Now, if you look at these sites, this is a bar graph. This is very difficult to understand, right? Should you look at the economic one or the social one and so on? What we find is that if we rank in terms of economic growth, a particular site emerges as the most important one. If we go for green growth, the site E remains the best one, but the other sites have switched around a little bit. And if we go for inclusive green growth, which is low resettlement, E is still the best site, but some of the other sites have also shifted. So the ranking shifts depending on what we use. And I prefer the last one, inclusive green growth, which will give you a ranking of all the 25 sites in the proper way, right? And this is maybe a little complicated, but this is one way of looking at it graphically. Economic cost is one axis, resettlement is the second axis, biodiversity loss is the third axis. What do you want to choose? You want to choose low economic cost, you want to choose low resettlement, you want to have low biodiversity loss. So if you look at the green circle near the origin, near the beginning, those are the best sites. If you look at the red circle, those are the worst sites because they are far away. They have high economic cost, lot of resettlement, lot of biodiversity loss. So in this way, you can also choose, right? So there are methods of using this BIGG approach to choose different technologies. One warning though, with power generation planning, you cannot look at one technology or one site at one time. You have to look at the whole system plan, and when you do ranking, you have to compare alternative system plans. Okay? So this is very important. So you have to include, of course, environmental and social variables, but it has to be looking at a complete system plan, not a single power plant. And that is very important to remember. It's not a simple decision. Right. So we try to put now in this BIGG also sustainable producers and sustainable consumers together. Why is this? Sustainable production, I will show you, is a very key step in the BIGG, but also the consumers have to be sustainable. If this philosophy spreads through the economy, then you will have a sustainable society. You can have traditional markets, say organic markets and so on, for old people like me, for the young people, online markets. I'm also sponsoring some sustainable product markets online as well. Okay? These are use the modern tools, internet and so on, to promote sustainable production and consumption. I've worked with some of the biggest companies in the world, where sustainability and triple bottom line is the wave of the future. Some of them are serious, some of them not so serious, but let us work with them, let us push them to do the right thing. Resource use efficiency is the starting point. Why? Because when a company adopts, say, energy saving practice, they can produce more using less energy. So their costs go down, their profits increase. They love it. So they are making good profit, but they are also improving the environment. So those win-win options are the ones that we want to follow. And a lot of these companies have adopted these techniques. And I've talked to the boards of directors, the senior management of these companies. Let me skip that part and just tell you what I tell them is this. Magic formula. It's not a bad thing to make money, but you also can be good, ethical values, and then you can become happy and contented. And this approach of resource efficiency is one of the ways to do it. Certainly for consumption, one of the points I have to make is, if you look at the top picture, you will see this is an affluent family in Europe. There is a lot of food waste. As an example, 30 to 50% of food that reaches the family table gets wasted. So you can reduce that waste. Then you become a sustainable consumer. Less packaging and other things. You can have the same quality of life but use less resources. The poor family at the bottom, it's a different story. You're not asking them to conserve. You have to raise them out of poverty because they are starving. So that's a different path. It's the tunnel path, right? Other methods. I have sponsored a group called Sustainomusica. We have a website and a Facebook page as well. These are young people who are creating the music of sustainability. Why? Because this kind of discussion reaches 0.0001% of the world's population, only the intellectuals. But there are millions of young people who are going to raves and rock concerts and other things. If we can reach them, so much the better. You have to get the message across. Sustainomusica is doing that. If anybody is interested, I'll give you a contact on that. And the last point now I'm coming to is how we show global leadership. The rise of Asia. What does this figure tell you? In 0 AD, the center of gravity of the economic center of gravity of the world was somewhere in Asia, okay, because you had India and China, they were important. By the 1950s, it has moved completely towards the Atlantic. Why? Because of Europe and North America. But 2018, it's moved back to Asia, and it is now continuing to Asia. So the 21st century is the century of Asia. Okay, be proud of it. I'm very proud of it as a Sri Lankan, and we will show what sustainability is. Because when the center of gravity moved to the North Atlantic, it became a very unsustainable pattern of consumption. We have to show the sustainable eco-civilization of the 21st century. And we also go from a unipolar to a multipolar world order. This is slightly political, but it's very clear now that one country can not have hegemonic control over the world, because it leads to a lot of wars and interventions and violent things and currency manipulation. One currency cannot dominate the world. We should have a multipolar world, which is where we are emerging, where you have Europe, China, and so on, and multiple currencies, not only the US dollar, but also the euro and the yuan and others. You have other, like the BRICS Bank and Asian Infrastructure, International Infrastructure Bank and others, which will join the World Bank and the IMF. So these are all centered more in Asia, but it means that we have a more balanced world. Okay, this is what is emerging. And the role of Taiwan, which is my last section, I think you have a very key role to play. You are emerging society with economic, social, and environmental assets. You can mobilize civil society and business to work with government, and you are able to connect. I think not only east-west, but north-south. Wonderful connector. And this is an important role. You have been making progress on SDGs. I looked at some of the priority areas. The sustainable energy transformation is one of the key areas that you have identified, but also water, air, materials management, and so on. These are some of the priorities for the Sustainable Development Goals. The rising share of renewables up to 2025, going from a reliance of 46% on coal to, in 2017, to 20% share of renewables in 2025. Renewables goes up from 5 in 2017 to almost 20%, fourfold increase in 8 years. This is going to be a challenge. Let us see how you do, which is phasing out the nuclear, reducing coal, maybe increasing some gas. There is a lot of, I think Thai Power, I worked with Thai Power for more than 30 years. They're a very competent company, but they have to be given clear directions. You cannot change direction every few years. It's very difficult. So if you have a steady direction, you will make it, because I think the Taiwanese are very creative and very talented people. And you will have a diverse future energy mix which is sustainable. You have some climate vulnerabilities which you need to be careful of. Disasters, infrastructure, water, land, coastal zones, and so on. But I'm sure as your development path becomes more sustainable, you will also protect or climate-proof your economy quite successfully. Sri Lanka has also, through its Sustainable Sri Lanka vision and strategic path, trying to follow this BIGG path. Focus on economy, but also a green environment and an inclusive society. And we are also trying to aspire to upper middle income status by 2030. I'm going to skip these slides and just end by saying that human resource is our greatest asset. Okay? We need to train future leaders. I believe in the youth. You are going to solve the problems. You want to educate sustainable consumers and producers. You want business and civil society to work with government. But people are the core of the solution, right? Watch out for external shocks. They're always there. Economic crises, you can have financial breakdown in the future, environmental crises, social unrest, and of course, climate change. I think the solution is in your hands to build a more sustainable and resilient society. Some of the areas for future shock, since you're very much into technology here, are the disruptive technologies. If you can master these, then you can make the transition to a sustainable future. It's very important, right? And you have the talents and the skills to do this. So it's not just a sustainable energy transformation by itself, but a sustainable transformation of the whole economy into a sustainable future. And let me end with this personal advice. That is, you cannot save the planet or harmonize the earth unless you harmonize yourself. There is the work, income, job satisfaction. Okay, these are extremely important. But you also need your health, your fitness, and so on. Because it's useless having a lot of money if you have a heart attack before you're 50, right? The last point, don't forget your friends, your family, and so on. These three are the personal sustainability triangle for a well-balanced person. Those kinds of people can also save the planet. And don't forget also the ethics and values that underline all of this, right? My final message is this. We live in a complex world with complex problems, but we know the solutions. We know how to do it. It's just that we are not getting on with the job. So act now. Business and civil society should work hard to push governments to do that right thing, and Taiwan's people and leaders can promote sustainable energy development and create new values and behaviors for this 21st century global eco-civilization. This is an ancient blessing from Sri Lanka. It says, may the rains come in time, that is environment. May the harvest be bountiful, which is economy. May the people be happy and content. May the king be righteous, that is society. So many hundreds of years ago, my ancestors knew about the Sustainable Development Triangle. I'm just trying to rediscover it now, okay? My institute does a lot of work, research on sustainability. Please contact me. There are books and other things. And please, I would like to stay in touch with you. Siya, Stuti, thank you.